Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diana Conway. Welcome. I'm the president of the Women's Democratic Club of Montgomery County, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us. Women's Democratic Club, WDC, is a membership club of over 600 active women and men, many of them elected officials, and we are the largest, most active Democratic club in Montgomery County. I hope you will consider joining the club if you're able to. Before we get to today's speaker, Professor Angela Davis, I have a few announcements and some brief remarks, and then I will introduce the professor. We welcome your questions throughout the program, and we'll get through as many as possible. Please put them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We have a lot going on these days, not just around us, but in WDC. I'm happy to say we've just established a task force entitled the Racial Equity and Public Safety Committee, and just testified this past week on Councilmember Jawando's bill on police use of force. We are deeply engaged also in ongoing programs to get out the vote. WDC has a number of partner organizations focusing on swing districts and super states, and we are holding letter writings, phone banks, text banks, postcarding. Some folks are involved in fundraising, all the necessary granular steps of securing our democracy, winning it back, and changing the direction of the country. You'll see some slides later on with a bunch of resources. I just wanted to highlight a couple. And these are all Zoom events with Bring Your Own Treat. There's a Monday dessert party at 7:30 p.m. There's a Tuesday letter writing Zoom, which I co-host with Lisa Fuller from the MoCo Women organization. Wednesday, Maryland Women for Biden is hosting phone banks into swing districts. And surprisingly these days, people are eager to talk about politics. You get through to a lot more people than is typical. Thursday, there's a coffee break letter writing at 2 p.m. And Friday, there's another postcarding event for North Carolina and also Pennsylvania. So we are an export state at this point in Maryland and hope you can join one of these activities. There's also good work being done by an organization called 31st Street, which does some fundraising and outreach as well. And as I said, this is the granular and critical work to give us a democratic tsunami that will be beyond even Trump's ability to challenge for its legitimacy. So many WDC members are doing this work, from our board members who work on these events at our website to members working for candidates. And I hope you will join us on this journey to help elect the change we need. You'll also see a slide later for the July 13th speaker program for Mr. DeRay McKesson, who is the co-founder of Campaign Zero and #8Can'tWait, which is an initiative that WDC testified in support of at the council hearing on police use of force. And on July 21st, we will be hearing from Kristen Clark, who is the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. She's spoken to us before, and one of their main focuses is the voter suppression. You can register for all of these on our website, which also has the Get Out the Vote activity details. And importantly, the website has an impressive list of resources, books, films, and podcasts that you can use to get yourself informed about this moment in our history and the realities that got us here. All right, that's it for announcements. Let's get into our program. I found it hard to write this introduction because I'm out of adjectives. I think the one I'm on today is tumultuous. We have the pandemic, we have elections, and we have national upheaval that we're here to discuss today. I think all three of those have as a common axis the issue of race. On the pandemic, there are over 71,000 cases just in Maryland, and we know it's hitting Black and brown communities disproportionately. The question was put to me earlier: what would things be like today if the disproportionality was in the way it was hitting white communities? How would the response have been different? On the election, we face wobbly ballot access and domestic interference as well as foreign interference. Trump has already declared the process as rigged, even as our governors around the state and our state legislatures are the ones rigging it. Just this week in Maryland, the governor was presented with three options on how to go forward safely with the November vote and picked two pieces of two different options to come up with the worst possible solution. One is to send a four-part four-part back and forth to get people to vote by mail. They're going to send, he would like to send an application for vote by mail to every voter. They have to fill it out, send it back, and then receive the application and then fill that out and get it back. I think you know who that is designed to discourage. Alternatively, they can go stand in line and risk their lives to vote, or they can just not vote. This and other voter suppression models are almost childishly transparent. And the third axis, I believe, is the uprising we're facing now at the core of today's topic, and it's an overdue reckoning with the racist structure and history of our own country. Part of the challenge is the spectrum of voices we're hearing and the proposed solutions. Some are quite gentle and meek, calling for applying a racial equity lens about how to teach history. And others want the wholesale overturning of major institutions. There's fear, outrage, pain, and hate. And this isn't new, of course. We know it's just louder, and it's finally being heard again. Many agree the 911 calls need to go to people who are trained to decide whether to dispatch a social worker or someone with a gun. Not surprisingly, it would be a difficult process to teach. And you can imagine the vitriol coming from Trump, especially a second-term Trump, if anything were to go wrong in responding to such a call. So we've got our work cut out. I hope you'll join WDC and our sister organizations in doing this work. And we each have the power to change the world according to the way we behave in it. So now on to introducing Professor Davis. Ms. Davis is a professor of law at American University's Washington College of Law and an expert in criminal law and procedure with a specific focus on prosecutorial power and racism in the criminal justice system. She previously served as director of the DC Public Defender Service and as executive director of the National Rainbow Coalition and clerked for the chief judge of the DC Court of Appeals. She is the author of a book called Arbitrary Justice: The Power of the American Prosecutor, and editor of Policing the Black Man: Arrest, Prosecution, and Imprisonment, as well as one called Trial Stories and the 7th edition of the Basic Criminal Procedure Law School book. Her other scholarly publications include articles in numerous top law reviews. Professor Davis has won a Soros Senior Justice Fellowship, as well as the American University Scholar Teacher of the Year Award and the AU Faculty Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Research. And I'm sorry, I did that one. She is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Frederick Douglass Jordan Scholarship Board and of the Southern Center for Human Rights and the Sentencing Project. She served as a member of the American Bar Association Commission on Effective Criminal Sanctions and as a member of the advisory board for the Vera Institute of Justice, Prosecution, and Racial Justice Program. At AU, she teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, and criminal defense theory and practice. Her expertise is in criminal justice with a specific focus on prosecutorial power and racism in the criminal justice system. I think we're seeing a theme. Professor Davis holds a BA from Howard University and a JD from Harvard University Law School. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Davis. Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Diana, for that introduction. And thanks to you and to Barbara Zelenko and all the members of the Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club for having me today and everyone else for joining us. Your work is so important, especially in these very difficult times. So thank you for all you're doing to help restore our democracy and preserve it. Thank you. Today, I want to talk to you all about the many racial injustices in our criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system is, quite frankly, in a state of crisis right now. We have 2 million, 2.1, 2.2 million people in prisons and jails, federal and state prisons and jails around the country. About 7 million people under criminal justice control, either on parole or probation or in prison or in jail. And we have severe unwarranted racial disparities in our criminal justice system. People of color are more likely than white Americans to be arrested Once arrested, they're more likely to be convicted. Once convicted, they're more likely to face stiff sentences. And this is for engaging in the same alleged behavior. African-American men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. And if the current trends continue, 1 in 3 Black men will serve time in prison during his lifetime, as compared to 1 in 17 white men. So the bottom line is that Black and brown people are treated worse than their similarly situated white counterparts at every step of the criminal process, from arrest through sentencing. And that's, quite frankly, whether they're a victim of a crime or charged with a crime. And the causes of these racial disparities are complex and varied, but it is well documented that one of the main causes for these racial disparities are discretionary decisions that are made by criminal justice officials at various points in the criminal process. So, for example, police officers. Police officers have a tremendous amount of discretion and power, and oftentimes they engage in racial profiling, right? So they have a lot of power on the street to stop individuals and search them. And when they engage in racial profiling, they're stopping individuals, frisking them, throwing them on the ground, doing all of those things without a legal basis, and doing it based on that individual's race. And the phenomenon of racial profiling has been well documented for many years. There was even a lawsuit in New York where the city of New York and the New York Police Department was successfully sued for engaging in racial profiling. And so this is a phenomenon that continues. And so we definitely need to, for all the reasons we know, we need to transform the police function, for sure. And that's something that I if we have time, would like to talk about. But I want to spend most of my time today talking about prosecutors, frankly, because a lot of people don't focus on prosecutors. Just as police officers have a lot of discretion and power in our criminal justice system, prosecutors have a tremendous amount of power. In fact, I would suggest to you that prosecutors are the most powerful individuals, the most powerful officials in our criminal justice system. And the reason I say that is because although police officers have a lot of power to stop individuals and to arrest them, and they can do so on a very low standard and very easily, police officers can only bring an individual to the courthouse door. It is the prosecutor who decides whether that individual stays in the system. And that's because police officers can only recommend charges, but it is the prosecutor who decides whether an individual is going to be charged with a crime and what those charges, if any, will be. And that is a tremendous, tremendous power. And let me just give you an example to explain what I mean. Let's say a police officer arrests an individual who has 5 bags of cocaine on them. Arrests that individual, brings the individual to the courthouse, and they may recommend to the police officer, they may recommend to the prosecutor that that individual be charged with 5 counts of possession with intent to distribute cocaine, which is a felony offense in every jurisdiction that carries a long sentence. In many jurisdictions, in most jurisdictions, a mandatory minimum sentence, meaning if the person is convicted, they have to serve that amount of time, and the judge has no discretion. And in a lot of jurisdictions, that offense may carry 5 or 10 mandatory years in jail. Well, the prosecutor has a lot of options at that point. The prosecutor can accept the recommendation of the police officer and charge that individual with 5, 10-year mandatory minimum offenses, or they can decide to give the person a break just because they want to. They can say, you know what, I'm not going to charge this person first offender or whatever. I'm going to give this person a break. Or they can charge them with a misdemeanor, even if they have the evidence to charge them with a felony. And it's totally up to the prosecutor. Now, this is an incredible amount of power, and it's very, very easy, despite, you wouldn't think this based on how prosecutors have not been charging these police officers that have killed all these Black and brown men and women, but it's actually very, very easy for prosecutors to bring charges because the standard is a very low standard. It's called probable cause. More probable than not, right? It's a much lower standard than the proof beyond a reasonable doubt that they would need to actually convict the person at trial. And so what happens is a lot of prosecutors will just pile on charges to give them an advantage at the plea bargaining stage, right? If you all heard of this phenomenon called plea bargaining, where people, the prosecutor might say, you know, I'll cut you a break. You're charged with 5 mandatory minimums. Tell you what, I'll dismiss 4 of them if you'll plead guilty to 1. Well, even if a person is innocent, it puts them in a very difficult position because going to trial is risky business. Every person has a constitutional right to go to trial. But if you're facing 5 mandatory minimum offenses that, you know, which amounts to 50 years if you're convicted of everything, if you go to trial and a jury convicts you, you're going to prison for the rest of your life. So you can see how even an innocent person would accept a plea under those circumstances. And you can see how this happens. And it happens. What I'm describing to you is not unusual. This is what passes as justice in our criminal justice system every single day. And I should tell you that about 95 to 98% of all criminal cases are resolved by way of a guilty plea. Most people take the deal, right? And that whole process, the charging, whether to charge the person, the plea bargaining, all of that is controlled entirely by the prosecutor. The judge has no say, the judge can't, they can suggest something, but it's totally up to the prosecutor. So you can see why I say that prosecutors control our criminal justice system, basically. And where do the racial disparities come in? Well, if they're making these decisions behind closed doors, and one person gets a deal and another person doesn't get a deal, you can see where there are disparities. And oftentimes those disparities break down along class and race lines. So again, just to give you another example, hypothetical, let's say you got a kid, a white kid, who is arrested for selling drugs in his high school. And you can tell that's a hypothetical because rarely is that going to happen to a middle-class white kid. But bear with me. Let's say a white kid, Todd, is arrested for selling dope at his high school. His case is brought to the prosecutor. Middle-class kid, his parents are able to afford to hire a good lawyer for him. The lawyer comes in, talks to the prosecutor and says, look, Todd has a drug problem. And he's a good kid otherwise. He's got a bright future. He's been admitted to college. Please don't ruin his life by charging him with this felony. In fact, his parents are going to put him in a residential drug program to deal with his drug problem because that's really what led him to sell drugs in the first place. Please give him this opportunity. If he successfully completes this drug program, would you please dismiss the case? Prosecutor looks at the kid and says, I don't want to ruin this kid's life. I used to do a little drugs when I was in high school. This kid's got a future. I don't want to be responsible for ruining his life. So he says, okay, if Todd completes that program, I'm going to dismiss the case. And honestly, I think that's probably a smart thing to do. We shouldn't be dealing with drug problems in our criminal justice system. So I think a prosecutor who makes that decision is making a good decision. But let's say there's another kid, Jamal, African-American, high school dropout, doesn't have parents who have means. He's arrested for the same offense. His public defender, his overworked public defender comes to the prosecutor and says, Jamal has a drug problem. His parents can't afford to put him in a program. He doesn't really have a program right now, but please give him a break. He's a first offender too. Prosecutor looks at Jamal and he's not really having the same empathy for him. Or he's saying, wish I could help him, but he doesn't have a drug program, so I'm gonna charge him with the felonies. So Jamal ends up in the system, Todd doesn't. Does that make the prosecutor a racist? I don't think so. I'm not suggesting that that prosecutor is a racist. I'm suggesting to you that the decision that that prosecutor makes is causing an unwarranted, unfair racial disparity in our criminal justice system. And it's complicated. I mean, how does it happen? There's this thing called implicit bias that we all suffer from, right? The unconscious views that we all as human beings have that cause us to look at people differently or treat them differently based on race, ethnicity, body type, skin color, gender, sexual orientation. And we're not even aware that it's going on, right? It's an unconscious feeling. And everybody, people of all races, everybody suffers from this implicit bias. But when a person of power, like a prosecutor, is making decisions based on that implicit bias, it's a problem, right? Because they have the power to take away a person's liberty and even their life in instances where there's a death penalty. And so you can see why I say that prosecutors have a tremendous amount of power in our system and how they control our system and how they contribute both to mass incarceration by charging cases that really don't even belong in our criminal justice system, and by the decisions they make that create these racial disparities. There's too much, we deal with too many of the issues in our world, in our communities, through the criminal justice system, and they really, quite frankly, don't belong there. People who come into the system because of mental health issues or drug problems. And by and large, these decisions are made in ways that mean that poor people and poor people of color end up in the criminal justice system to deal with those problems, with, quite frankly, don't deal with them, whereas other people have those problems dealt with outside of the criminal justice system. And that's not fair. That's something that needs to change. So I will say again, prosecutors, the charging decision is huge. And in most instances, when it comes to people of color and poor people, they overcharge, except when it comes to police officers. When it comes to police officers, the script is flipped. Prosecutors rarely charge police officers when they kill Black and brown men and women and children. Even when there's not just probable cause, but when there's overwhelming evidence of guilt. So remember I said all that prosecutors need to charge someone is this low standard probable cause, more probable than not, which causes them to easily charge people. That's the same standard whether it's a police officer or someone else. But when it comes to police officers, for some reason, they're not bringing charges. And it's extraordinary because with a lot of these cases that we've seen, where there's been videotape, there's not been just probable cause. They know that they have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. There's overwhelming evidence of guilt. So we all saw, for example, years ago, 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Ohio, who was playing with a toy gun in a park and he was gunned down. On videotape, we saw that 12-year-old boy be killed by those police officers. Eric Garner on Staten Island, killed much the same way as George Floyd, choked to death. We saw this with a cell phone camera on videotape. But neither the police officer who killed Tamir Rice nor the police officer who killed Eric Garner were ever even charged with an offense at all, right? And even in the few cases where there have been charges brought, Terrence Crutcher, who had his hands in the air and was shot by a police officer, it was on videotape, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Philando Castile, again on videotape. Charges were ultimately brought, but the police officers were found not guilty at trial, even though the killings were on videotape. And then, of course, the more recent horrific killings. Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, who was hunted down and killed on February 23rd of this year. And there were no charges brought against him until May the 7th. And why? Because the videotape emerged and there was tremendous public pressure on the prosecutors. The initial prosecutor who saw the case in February 23rd said, no charges, wrote a memo saying, no, we're not going to charge. But we saw that horrific killing, which was clearly a murder. And it wasn't until the videotape was revealed that the prosecutors were forced to charge the killers. Breonna Taylor, African-American woman, 26 years old, asleep in her bed, a first responder, killed by police officers issuing a no-knock warrant at the wrong home. To this day, those police officers have not been charged with a crime. And then, of course, there's George Floyd, who, we watched for an excruciating 8 minutes and 46 seconds as that police officer choked the life out of him, as he begged for his life, as others around the officer begged him to stop. 8 full minutes while looking directly into a cell phone camera as if to say, I don't care. I mean, he just killed him, slowly. And it was horrible And charges were not brought immediately against him. It was not until there was burning in the street. In fact, the police station was actually burned to the ground. And it wasn't until that happened that the prosecutor finally decided to bring charges. Initially very weak charges, and then it was, of course, transferred to the Attorney General, where charges were finally brought. And amazingly, despite all the protests all over the world and the sense that maybe things were changing, because things were different after that, right? The protests in the street, people of all races, of all ages, all over this country and all over the world were standing up saying this has to stop, but yet the killings are still happening, right? So Rayshard Brooks was asleep in his car, intoxicated in Georgia, and he was somehow ended up being murdered by the police. That happened after the protest. That happened after, George Floyd and all of that. And so, and a number of people are still being killed. I mean, I don't have the time to go down the list, unfortunately, of all the people who are being killed. So the question is, why does this keep happening, right? Well, first of all, it has been happening since the time of slavery, where people who, law enforcement officers have taken the law in their own hands and killed Black and brown bodies. This has been going on for hundreds of years. Emmett Till's death, all through the civil rights movement. But it wasn't until the cell phone cameras that people began to actually say, you know what? People have been saying all along this is going on. We now see it with our own eyes. But yet, even though there's cell phone footage, the police officers keep doing it. Trayvon Martin's death was a pivotal moment. There wasn't video camera there, but all the other cases I mentioned to you before where there was actually videotape, yet the killings keep happening. And the question is why? And I think there's a lot of reasons for it. First and foremost, there's racial bias, right? A lot of these police officers just simply do not see Black and brown bodies as human. They don't see the humanity in African-American and Latino people. They don't. And so they don't feel that empathy, and they kill them because they don't see the humanity in them. And the other thing is that police officers are trained to use violence even when they don't have to, right? Which is why we need to dismantle the entire police function and start over, in my opinion, which is something I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But there's another reason why I think this is happening, and that's because cops are not held accountable. And that gets me back to prosecutors, right? The individual, the official in our system who's supposed to hold these officers accountable is the prosecutor, the chief law enforcement officer. Why are they overcharging Black and brown people on the scantest of evidence for oftentimes petty offenses, but almost never charging police officers when the evidence is overwhelming and on videotape? Why is that? Well, first of all, cops and prosecutors have a cozy relationship. They work together, right? Police officers are their witnesses. They rely on police officers to investigate their cases. They work together as a team. Prosecutors, police officers, and particularly police unions often contribute to the chief prosecutor's election campaigns, right? And so they have this cozy relationship. And so there's an inherent conflict of interest, right? And which is why a lot of people call for independent prosecutors to come in on these cases. So let me say something about prosecutors, and then I'll close and take whatever questions you have. So prosecutors, the elected prosecutors, the vast majority of chief prosecutors across the country are elected officials, right? So first, we have a federal system where we have U.S. attorneys as the prosecutors. We have a state system also. The vast majority of criminal cases, like I would say 90% of all criminal cases, are handled on the state and federal, on the state and local level, not the federal level. You all have heard of the federal legislation, and it's important, but 90% of all criminal cases are handled on the state and local levels, and all but 4 or 5 jurisdictions, the prosecutors are elected officials. And there are about between 2,500 and 3,000 state and local elected prosecutors across the country. By county, sometimes they're elected by the county, sometimes they're city prosecutors. In the state of Maryland, they're called state's attorneys. In a lot of jurisdictions, they're called district attorneys. In Maryland, they're called Commonwealth attorneys, but it's the same thing. They're an elected official. They're elected to be the chief prosecutor for their jurisdiction, and then they are hire assistant prosecutors to handle the cases. And we need to pay attention to elected prosecutor races. Historically, people have not really paid attention to those particular elections. And the reason is because oftentimes, most times, you have someone who is running unopposed. Sometimes they serve for decades. You go in the ballot box, there's one name there, people check it off or not. And so, of course, they are not being held accountable because they don't think they have to. No one's challenging them. Most of them, when they run, they don't talk about their charging and plea bargaining decisions. Most people don't even know what those are. They certainly aren't talking about mass incarceration and the role that they play in it and what they're going to do to stop it. They're not talking about that stuff. And so they end up getting elected and they're not held accountable. Well, that's starting to change. People are starting to pay attention to district attorney races. In recent years, I'd say starting around 2015, you started to see some progressive candidates begin to challenge the chief district attorneys and running on a progressive platform. By progressive, I mean running for district attorney saying, I'm going to use my power and discretion to reduce the incarceration rate, to get rid of racial disparities, to divert cases out of the, minor offenses out of the system, people who have drug problems. I'm going to seek an alternative to incarceration and focus on violent crime and not have people incarcerated who are not posing a danger to the community. And I'm going to hold police officers accountable when they use excessive force. There are people who are starting to run and win on that platform. You all may have heard of Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Kim Fox in Cook County in Chicago, Kim Gardner in St. Louis, and there are many others. And so people are starting to pay attention to district attorney races, and I think that's incredibly important. We all need to pay attention to those races to hold them accountable, to hold these prosecutors accountable, to ensure that we vote out those state's attorneys or elected prosecutors who are unnecessarily prosecuting poor people and people of color while allowing cops to get away with murder. So I hope that everyone will start to focus on prosecutor races just to make sure that all of these problems, not to make sure, but at least to help to work towards making sure that our criminal justice system becomes more fair than it is. Because right now, this country has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and it doesn't have to be that way. But it all comes back to democracy, which is why the work that your club does is so important. Paying attention to races, and I hope you'll include state's attorneys' races in the work that you do. So I'll stop there and take whatever questions you have.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Professor Davis. That was tremendous. I neglected, well, first of all, if you'd like to submit additional questions, please use that slide to submit them in the chat box. I neglected to do something that the professor asked me to do, which I had to do many times before when the question came up, which was to distinguish our Angela Davis, Angela J. Davis, from a rather more notorious or well-known, or West Coast anyway, Angela Davis, Angela Y. Davis. So thank you for those comments. I think we're going to have a good flow of questions, so I'm going to just dive right in. Thank you also for mentioning the importance of the election for the state's attorney, and I assume that goes also for the state attorneys general across the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so our state attorney in Montgomery County, John McCarthy, and our state's attorney is Brian Frosch. Our Attorney General is Brian Frosch, thank you. So those are names that you may know, and you need to think about whether you like them next time they are on the ballot. The first question I'd like to ask you is specifics in terms of reforming the police and reforming the prosecutorial authority, that chain of events. Are there specific steps? WDC, for example, has gotten into the 8 Can't Wait camp as a first step in the process. And those 8 elements include things like banning chokeholds, which is fairly straightforward, requiring that an officer's record follow them across jurisdictions so that it's harder for a state's attorney to say, oh, I didn't know he had been fired in 4 previous jurisdictions for doing exactly what this officer is doing now, he or she, of course. So what specific steps do you support? Can you address the 8 can't wait? Should we get rid of things like broken window policing, nuisance laws? I know our delegate Janelle Wilkins just recently had removed the criminalization of barbering without a license. And I think we all can guess where that behavior was taking place. So hope that's enough questions to get us started.
Yes, sure. So the 8 can't wait movement, I think, is incredibly important. And I think that all of the suggestions there, banning chokeholds, that's sort of basic, right? Engaging in training police officers on de-escalation tactics, for example, how to, when approaching a situation, not to immediately resort to force. All of the suggestions there are important, and I think those need to be implemented right away, and they can be on the state and local level. They absolutely can be. But I think while those reforms, if you will, are being implemented, I do believe that we need to rethink and reimagine the entire police function. So many of you may have heard of this phrase, defund the police. And I don't like that title, because I think the title defund the police just gives red meat to the Republicans, and it's kind of a misnomer anyway. When people talk about defunding the police, most people think, oh my God, they're going to get rid of the police. I'm not going to be able to call 911. I even saw some Republican garbage out there about how, oh, you're not going to be able to call 911. I think it was an ad on television or something, which is not at all what this movement is about. What this movement is saying is that what we need to do is remove a lot of the functions we're now giving to the police officers that, quite frankly, they are not trained to handle, to professionals who can handle them. So when someone is having a mental health episode, a breakdown, we've seen too many examples here, most recently in Fairfax County. Police are called and they do what they're trained to do. They're trained to use force. They see somebody, and if that person's fighting or flailing around, they jump on them, they pin them down, they choke them, they do. That's what they're trained to do. They're not trained to how to de-escalate a situation and handle someone who's having that episode. Same thing with people who are dealing with other kinds of issues. Someone who's a substance abuse. There's someone who's having an overdose. They're like, oh, that's possession of whatever the drug is. Let me grab him, handcuff them, and send him. So the point is, instead of calling the police for people who are having those public health issues, call a professional person who's actually trained to handle those problems. Get that person help. They don't need to be in the criminal justice system. They're not a danger to the community, right? And so we need to start thinking about that model. And honestly, it's starting to happen, believe it or not, already. Albuquerque, the city of Albuquerque has what people are calling it an alternative police station. It's not a police station. It's an alternative. I think it's called the Department of Public Safety or something like that. No armed police officers there at all. Mental health professionals, substance abuse professionals, violence prevention professionals who can go out and stop fights and, de-escalate situations so people don't have to be arrested. But they still have a police department with armed officers to handle when there's a violent offense or someone's robbed or there's a sexual assault or a homicide or something like that. We do need police officers for that. And so I think that's really what we need to do if we really want to transform this system. Just little reforms here and there, I think, is not going to really get us where we need to be.
Okay, thank you. And I assume, I think I heard you correctly, that the idea of an 8 can't wait, those specific items you support.
Absolutely. I think they're all incredibly important. We need to be pushing our officials to implement those right away, because I think this whole notion of transforming the police function is going to take a while. In the meantime, we need to implement these very important reforms of the 8 can't wait movement.
So in addition to reforming the behavior of police themselves, talk about removing the barriers that make it hard or make it uninteresting to prosecute police officers for misconduct or to recover damages when that's the case.
So starting with recovering damages, right, there's this concept called qualified immunity that makes it very difficult for individuals to sue police officers when they're the victim of police violence. And there's a movement to get rid of it, both on the federal level, the Congress. There's the George Floyd policing, I forget the exact name of it, but it's a bill in the House now that's been passed by the House. And so there's work towards that, and that definitely needs to happen. But the other thing, and again, ask your other part of your question about the barriers to.
Well, what is it? I mean, you said there's a sort of a cozy relationship between the police, who are the witnesses for the prosecutors, but what else do you see in there that we can get at as a society in terms of removing barriers to that prosecution, or giving more of an incentive to fairly consider whether this police officer needs to be prosecuted?
Right. So there's a sort of a controversy around this in even the progressive prosecutor world. And that is, there are a number of people who think that whenever there is a shooting by a police officer, that an independent prosecutor from either another jurisdiction or someone who can act as a special prosecutor can come in and handle the prosecution of that case. The idea being that they don't know those specific police officers, they don't have a relationship with those specific officers, so they don't have that conflict of interest. And I think that was the idea, for example, with the officer who killed George Floyd. The local prosecutor was taken off the case, and Keith Ellison, who's a former congressman, who's now the attorney general, he's now prosecuting the case. And that's another option. Oftentimes the attorney general, who is again, and just to explain for people, the attorney general is kind of the statewide prosecutor. Most attorneys general don't handle everyday criminal cases. A lot of them deal with consumer protection issues, a lot of other issues. Some of them handle some criminal cases or like the review of wrongful convictions, but they don't handle the everyday cases. And so the attorney general would not have a relationship, for example, with the police officers in that jurisdiction. So I do think the idea of having a special prosecutor or even the attorney general of that state, depending on the circumstances, come in so that there's not a conflict. I think that's one way of handling. And then you have other prosecutors. It's complicated though, because you have some of these newer progressive prosecutors that I talked about before, who've come into office and said, for example, Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore City, she was very adamant, like, I want to prosecute these cops. I'm going to go after them, and I need to be the person doing it. You voted for me. So I see the argument on both sides, but I generally tend to come down on, I think it should be someone who's just independent, who does not have that relationship, so there's not a conflict.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions in here. What is the best way for a citizen, whether you're a citizen activist or somebody going to work in the morning, to identify the problems we're talking about here? And what is the best option for sort of a non-activist in terms of not only identifying it, but then finding a way to express the need for change? Do you have suggestions on?
When you say identify the problem, you mean how can a regular citizen sort of get involved to make change? Or?
Yeah, so I mean, where, for example, we can just talk about Montgomery County or Maryland or whichever jurisdiction you prefer, but where are these things, given how non-transparent the record keeping is, where are these things that people who are looking for it could go find the patterns and the evidence without turning, I mean, is there something out there that people can use at the more granular level to try to identify where this is happening, how it's happening in their own communities?
Well, I'm a firm believer in organizing, and I think there's power in numbers, and I think there are a lot of organizations out there who are working on these issues. Right here in Montgomery County, there's the NAACP, the ACLU on the local level, there's chapters, there's local organizations. Silver Spring has a criminal justice reform group. And I think that the best way that people can make an impact is by joining the Montgomery County Women's Democratic would be one, for example. And I was amazed, Diana, when you talked about what you've already done on criminal justice. That's phenomenal. I had no idea, and thank you. So joining with an organization, because there's power in numbers. And I think, a prosecutor, John McCarthy in Montgomery County, it would be really great, like if any of these organizations said to him, we'd like to have a meeting with you, and we'd like to know specifically what are you doing to reduce the incarceration rate here in Montgomery County, and what are you doing about the racial disparities, and to ask for a meeting. He works for you. And so I think there's power in that. It's like, demanding it of your elected officials, going to them with the issues, asking them what they're doing about the problem and demanding, change. And if you have specific proposals, great. But even if you don't, asking the questions gets their attention. That's how democracy is supposed to work. Heretofore, it hasn't worked that well with prosecutors because people really haven't paid that much attention to prosecutors. And so they've been, and all those decisions I talked to you about, they're made behind closed doors. There's no transparency whatsoever. They're not required to justify their decisions in open court or anywhere. But you have the right to ask those questions. And so I think organizing and asking those kinds of questions and presenting those demands to your elected officials is really the one way that you can go about doing it.
Well, thank you. That was a very nice softball for WDC. I appreciate that. I do want to confirm for late arrivals that we have a new task force for WDC called Racial Equity and Public Safety. And I think we will be taking you up on your suggestion of meeting with state's attorney as well as others to talk about their ability to defend or explain any patterns that we've got here.
And I'd be happy to confer with you on some.
Awesome. Lisa Henderson, I know you're our chair and you're out there listening, so take note. Another question, could you comment on the for-profit prison system, when it started, the significance that it plays in our system in Maryland?
So I don't know the specifics about Maryland. I think profit goes in, and this is not my particular area of expertise, but there's no question but that profit plays a huge role, right, in our prison system. There was this horrible movement toward private prisons where they weren't being regulated by the state or anyone else. The conditions were terrible. And I do think we need to take the profit motive out of that. I think it's unfortunate that people build a prison so that we can then hire correctional officers. That's not how we should grow our economy, by building prisons, right? I mean, locking other people up. So I think that's a problem. It's not something I can speak on directly with regard to Maryland because I don't have that particular expertise, but I do think that's a problem.
Okay, thank you. Police are overburdened with mental health as marriage counselors. The laundry list is long. What's the best way to direct? I mean, you addressed this a little bit in terms of, I guess, unbundling is the word that I've heard a lot, but the question goes in to ask a little bit about the language of racism versus anti-Blackness. Is that a distinction that you attach importance to? It looks like you don't know what I'm talking about.
No, I'm just listening.
Okay. Is that a distinction that you attach much importance to? Is that sort of beside the point for you?
Racism versus anti-Blackness, no,
Okay.
I don't make a distinction there. But the other point that you were making about police officers and sort of how we go about having them not deal with these issues around mental health and all of that. And I did already address it, but I do want to say one other thing about that. And that is, we don't elect our police chiefs, okay? We don't. But we elect our mayors and we elect our county executives. And in most jurisdictions, like if there's a city and there's a mayor, the mayor, like in Washington, D.C., the mayor appoints the police chief, right? So democracy still works here, right? So you can't, vote the police chief out if he or she's not implementing these, progressive policies and changing them. But you can, through your mayor, demand that your police department change, and they can do it. They don't. There's no law that has to be passed for a particular police department to institute de-escalation policies and to stop chokeholds and all of that. It can be done, but you have to make the demands on the individuals who are the officials who control the police departments. And I think that's how it can be done, and it should be done. You don't have to wait for a law to be passed, for example, for that to happen.
Right.
So, and let me say another word about that. And people are like, well, why is it that police officers are doing this? So here's the thing. The United States Supreme Court, in a series of cases, has police officers to use force when they really don't have to. And here's how that happens. The only thing that the United States Supreme Court does is decide whether a particular practice violates the United States Constitution or not. That's all they decide, right? So in a case called Terry versus Ohio, which allows police officers to stop and frisk a person if they believe the person poses a danger, right? They're allowed to, the Supreme Court specifically said in Terry versus Ohio, and police officers may use force in order to do that, and it doesn't violate the Constitution for them to do that. Well, just because something doesn't violate the Constitution doesn't mean it's right, and it doesn't mean that the police officers have to do it. It simply means it's not a constitutional violation. So the state and local police departments, they could have a policy of, we're not going to use force when we arrest people for nonviolent offenses. They can do that, right? Just because the Supreme Court says you can, doesn't mean you have to. And that's why there is power in state and local entities making these changes. It can be done if the people demand it.
That's a perfect line for me to use. I'd like this very much. I read it somewhere else. I'm cribbing a lot from the great writing out there, but voter suppression is an acknowledgement of the importance of your vote. And I think that is a great way to get people to think about the role that they can play, as you say, with meeting with the county executive or meeting with other elected officials. Another question is, beyond the issue of policing and police reform, there seems to be little agreement on the broader agenda to address structural racism and inequality. Policing is just the focal point. What else would you say needs to be a priority?
Well, I focus on the criminal justice system, but obviously racism permeates our entire society, right? You know, as far as housing is concerned, education is concerned, I think all of those are incredibly important. And what I say to people is not everybody can do everything or focus on every issue. I think people who have an interest in and an expertise in a particular area should focus on that particular issue, right? And so if you are an educator or you're a teacher and education is your field, we have all kinds of inequities in our education system. Work on that, right? If your interest is in another field, whatever that might be, unfortunately, racism permeates our entire society. And oftentimes it's all of these other issues that tend to bring people into our criminal justice system, right? The socioeconomic problems, right? The racism that is in our society as a whole, the inequities, the discrimination, right, that causes a person not to have a job and therefore not to be able to feed his or her family and therefore maybe steal because they can't feed their family, and then they end up in the criminal justice system. It just permeates. And so what I say to people is, find that issue that you care deeply and passionately about and work on that issue, because it's a huge and complex problem in our society and permeates all aspects of our society, and it can be overwhelming. But I think if all of us work on what we have a passion for and interest in, that we can make a difference.
Very well put. Another question, what is the role of transformative justice? And I've heard it referred to, or maybe it's different, restorative justice in these situations as we work toward abolishing the racism that's in our structural system?
Yeah, the restorative justice movement, I think, is a really important one. And so it really involves, and a lot of times there are some of these progressive prosecutors who are exploring that model. They oftentimes will use it more with juveniles in the juvenile system than the adult system, but also sometimes in the adult system as well, where even with an offense that's technically a violent offense, the victim and the person who is arrested, and it's only if the victim agrees to it, they will agree to meet, and the victim is permitted to tell the person the harm that they've caused them. And that person apologizes directly to the victim. And oftentimes it has resulted in not only healing for the victim, but also rehabilitation for the person who's charged. And it's being used, I would say, Carl Racine, who is the Attorney General in the District of Columbia, has very successfully used that model in the juvenile system, because the Attorney General in DC prosecutes juvenile cases, and he's had tremendous success with that. So I think it is it's not a huge movement now, but I think it's a great start, because frankly, if all we're focusing in on is diverting nonviolent offenses out of the system, we're still not going to make a dent in this horrible mass incarceration problem that we have. And so we have to look beyond that if we really want to make change.
Agreed. Okay, this is our final question. LEOBR, the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. Where do you fall on that? What are your thoughts on that? And how can people support the direction that you believe we need to go in?
So I think that particular act, and it's in a lot of jurisdictions where police officers try to protect themselves basically from being prosecuted. And I think it's a problem where there has to be a delay, for example, before there's an investigation and they don't turn over information. I think what we need to do is to demand total transparency when it comes to police officers. If they're engaged in the use of excessive force, particularly in these cases where people are harmed or killed, they need to be treated like everybody else. If you or I are involved in it, commit a crime, God forbid, kill someone or engaged in excessive violence, we're going to be held accountable. And so a lot of these acts, I think, serve to try to shield them from accountability. And I think it's really important that we as citizens, speak out against bills that tend to do that. A lot of them are trying to, and I will say this just in closing, police officers have a really difficult job. And I'm not here suggesting that every single police officer is a terrible person, but I also don't think that it's a one bad apple situation. It is a systemic problem in our police department, in our police departments across the country, which is why we need to sort of reimagine and rethink what we're talking about when it comes to police officers. But until we do that, I think we do need to hold them to the same standard we would hold anyone else who's out there committing a crime. They need to be held accountable. And bills that are enacted to protect them from that accountability should definitely not be passed, and we should be speaking out against them.
Well, I'd like to see some of them revoked. I've heard the most alarming or surprising things about a 72-hour cooling down period during which the Fraternal Order of Police comes in, advises them how to speak, if at all, advises them how to secure their pension before they decide if they're going to resign or not. Those are not advantages that anybody else I know.
Exactly. Exactly. Why should they get those protections when you and I
do not? Well, thank you, Professor Davis. We've had a tremendous back and forth. I really appreciate, especially your offer. I think we will be taking you up on your offer to consult with our new committee, and we'd love to hear from you again. I think WDC is looking forward to doing this work. I think we're lucky to be in a community that cares, with elected officials that largely feel accountable at some level to our community and who lean in. And of course, for thoughtful scholars like you who document the problems and point the way forward. In closing, I would like to remind our attendees that, as I said at the beginning, we have the power of change with the way we behave in the world. I hope you will join us for our upcoming events. We've got a slide here. DeRay McKesson, who, as I said, is the co-founder of Campaign Zero and 8 Can't Wait, and this is his newly released book. Our following speaker will be, as I mentioned, Kristen Clark from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And I would like to just talk about the things that WDC can do to enable you to make a difference, whether it's joining our club, volunteering for the numerous things that are listed on our website to get out the vote, to fundraise, to swing those swing districts in our direction. And I think there's a listing of our committees coming up with some names there. But again, you can go to our website and click Get Involved, and that should drop down for you as well. And I just really want to thank everybody for coming. I don't think this conversation could go forward without attendance and without our generous speakers who are giving us their time. I want to remind you that Professor Davis has her book out called Policing the Black Man. And that is something that we can get through Politics and Prose, I believe. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Professor Davis, and look forward to seeing you all at our next event.
Thank you.
We should be getting a closing slide here. There we go.
Thank you, Diana.
Thanks very much. I really appreciated your comments. It was terrific.
Thank you. I'm going to sign off now.